Over the course of every Gen Xer's life, there are several dichotomies in which you are expected to plant your flag. These aren't huge societal positions, but more very minor statements of preference, usually concerning various pop culture detritus. Marvel or DC, Nintendo or Sega, Betty or Veronica. And a good chunk of these also fell along the lines of former network primetime sitcoms that were endlessly rerun on daytime TV. I Dream of Jeannie or Bewitched, Ginger or Marianne, and of course, The Munsters or The Addams Family. For myself, I've always been more of an Addams Family man. The Munsters were just a little too silly and implausible for me, even as a kid. The Addamses seemed like the kind of people you might encounter in real life. The harmless but definitely eccentric weirdos. And that has mostly been their major characterization throughout their lifespan, from Charles Addams' original comics to, yes, the Wednesday series on Netflix. Or I assume so, at least. In the interest of full disclosure, I haven't actually watched Wednesday. Mostly because I personally have had enough of Tim Burton and his aesthetic, and honestly, I've never been a fan of the deadpan snarker version of Wednesday that's pretty much been a part of her character ever since the 90s. And there's nothing wrong with that interpretation, it just doesn't work for me personally, especially if it looks like you're taking the inherent weirdness of an Addams Family member and dropping them into a setting where everyone is as much of a weirdo as they are. No, my preferred version of the Addams Family has always been the original 1960s TV series, which is actually kind of funny when you consider that the central gag of that version was the idea that Mr. and Mrs. Suburbanite America would be laughing at the Addamses instead of with them. Look at those weirdos, Martha. Thank God we don't live in a place that allows those kind of people. Except, as others have pointed out, for Gen X kids like myself, we saw something inspirational in the Addams Family. Here were a bunch of people attracted to the taboo, the shocking, the weird, and more importantly, they just assumed everybody was as interested in this stuff as they were. They're unapologetically themselves, and in most incarnations, extremely welcoming to others. When you watch the original TV series, you realize that the Addams are relentlessly nice to everyone they encounter. They love meeting new people and bringing them into their world, with the joke being that they're completely oblivious to how much they frighten or annoy those people. Most of the time, they write off the myriad of visitors who run off screaming as just being unusually high-strung for some reason. Now, the sitcoms of the 1960s were not that deep in terms of plot or characterization. Nobody really changed or grew as characters, rarely did anybody learn anything that stuck, and if a show was built around a central gag like the Addams Family's weirdness, most of the time every episode revolved around some situation where that central gag was brought out and used over and over again for 25 minutes. Which makes one particular episode of the Addams Family stand out because its ending was not the usual Addams fare to that point. The Addams Family Meet a Beatnik is the 15th episode of the series and, at first, follows the standard beats of a newcomer meets the Addams story. Rocky, a leather-clad, motorcycle-riding beatnik who speaks primarily in slang, crashes his bike outside the Addams home. The bike needs to be fixed, which is a task Uncle Fester undertakes, but the bike needs a new drive chain, and Rocky finds out that the auto parts store can't get one to him until the next day, forcing him to spend the night at the Addams house. For their part, the Addamses love Rocky. They like his mode of speech and his general lifestyle, making some of their usual mistakes as to what some of his stuff is for.
What's this? Don't tell me. A modern streamlined flail.
A flail?
We seem to have mutual interests. I'm a devotee of weaponry, too.
As well as offering some of their more, unusual home remedies when it turns out Rocky's hurt his knee.
Lurch, hot oil, and plenty of it. Good stout length of rope. And Lurch, don't forget the leeches.
But the interesting thing about this episode is how it twists the usual ending, where the visitor to the house winds up running off at high speed for one reason or another. During the course of Rocky's stay, Gomez and Morticia discover that 1. It's Rocky's birthday, and 2. Rocky is actually Rockland Caldwell III, son of noted businessman Rockland Caldwell II, who, it just so happens, is currently out looking for his wayward son, along with the police. However, Wednesday and Pugsley endear themselves to Rocky when they don't rat him out when his father comes calling. Gomez and Morticia decide to throw a birthday party for Rocky, and not realizing that the relationship between father and son is very strained, invite his father, who sees it as an opportunity to get his offspring under control. And then this happens.
They're my kind of cooks, and they dig me the way I am. No rebuild jobs like... Okay, bring on the handcuffs.
No more handcuffs, son.
And for nearly the remainder of the show, with a couple of minor exceptions near the end, the laugh track shuts up and everything is played fairly quietly.
People accepted the boy just as he is. I tried to press him into a mold. If there's a kook around here, it must be me.
Of course, Rocky winds up going into his father's business at the very end of the episode because this is still 1964 and conformity still holds sway, but nonetheless, this episode stands out in the series because of its own subversion of the entire gag the show is based around. The Addams Family are meant to be the outliers, the weirdos, the ones who just don't fit in, and what we're supposed to be laughing at is how oblivious they are to the reactions of the quote-unquote normal people who encounter them. But the Addams Family Meets a Beatnik turns that on its head, showing Rocky's father as the one who may be out of touch with the wider world. The Addamses don't do anything differently with Rocky than they do with everyone else. The change comes from the use of Rocky and his father in the story. Rocky realizes that the Addams are nice, helpful people who just happen to be a little different from everyone else, just like himself. And Rocky's father realizes he doesn't have to make his son into a copy of himself, because even if he doesn't quite get it, there are people in the wider world who do, and that's nothing to be ashamed of. Maybe the message gets kind of muddied in the epilogue, but I really like this episode, and seeing it has convinced me that maybe it's time to go through the remaining episodes of the original Addams Family series and see if there's any other surprising stories that turn the entire show's premise on its head. And knowing the Addams Family, those surprises might be the most unsurprising thing about the entire show.
See the spider on the maypole, fa la 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 la.
That was lovely, darling. Those old English madrigals are enchanting.
A bit sentimental, but lovely.